May 1940. Across the fields and forests of Western Europe, the armies of France stand watch. Beyond the frontier, the German war machine gathers once more, preparing to strike into the heart of a blood-stained continent that has spent 2 short decades flirting with peace. 70 years prior, the riverside town of Sedan had played host to the decisive battle of the Franco-Prussian War, which established a new political order across Europe, with the capture and abdication of the final monarch of France, Napoleon III. Now, another high-stakes campaign in the same region threatens even further reaching consequences. This time, not simply for Europe, but for the entire world. This battle did not begin with the roar of engines across the Ardennes. It began a decade earlier, in the corridors of the French General Staff, in the tunnels of the Maginot Line, and in the principles and policies of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Was a new German way of war truly unstoppable in 1940? Was France doomed by its own shortcomings, or did incompetence and perhaps something even more insidious play a part? And how would the world come to understand and explain what happens here half a century later?
The Battle of Sedan was the turning point that sealed the fate of France, in that it established that the German tactics could not be countered at this point by the Western Allies.
The French are definitely not ready for modern war when the Germans come.
They severely underestimated the enemy. They thought that it would take the Germans between 7 and even up to 15 days to get through the Ardennes and cross the Meuse, and in fact they did it in 3.5.
Today, we answer those questions. The vision of a defensive barrier against Germany did not spring forth in a moment of panic, but rather out of the long shadow of the Great War. From Verdun to the Marne, the memory of bloodshed on an industrial scale scarred the French national psyche. To France, the lesson of 1914 to 18 was that never again could France allow herself to be caught unprepared, or forced into a headlong battle of attrition on open ground. This lesson had cost France an entire generation of its young men to learn. It was in this climate that André Maginot, veteran of the trenches and later Minister of War, championed the idea of a vast defensive line. To Maginot, fortification was not weakness, but prudence. In his mind, defense was the only way to preserve both the nation's security and its demographic strength. France, with fewer men than Germany, could not afford another Verdun. A wall of steel, concrete and guns, however, might make up the difference. The project bore his name, but it was not his alone. Men such as Paul Painlevé, Maginot's predecessor, and General Louis Cosson would champion, shape, and expand upon the idea.
The French felt themselves as losers because most of the war had taken place on French soil. 6% of the male population is dead, 30% of the industrial production destroyed. Therefore, after the war, they started thinking, what can we do to make sure that the next war will happen somewhere else, but not in France? And as they made positive experience with fortification, the forts around Verdun, during the Battle of Verdun in 1916, they decided, based on this experience, to construct a fortification line, mainly towards Germany and Italy.
Support for the line came from both left and right wings of Parliament, and after a time of initial planning beginning 1928, the first concrete was laid in late 1929. Huge casemates were sunk into the hillsides, with turrets able to rise and fire before disappearing again beneath armoured cupolas. Below ground stretched miles of galleries, underground barracks, command posts, hospitals, even narrow-gauge railways. It was, in many respects, a fortress city embedded in the earth. Experimental facilities were constructed first to test the viability of the idea. Then work was expanded along the entire front with Germany. By 1936, thousands of labourers had poured millions of cubic metres of reinforced concrete into the project, and France had expended a fortune, around 5 billion francs, on the project, about 7.5% of the army's entire budget between 1928 and 1936. Yet the line was not intended as a wall to cower behind. In French doctrine, it served a wider purpose: to hold the frontier, conserve manpower, and give time for mobilization. With the Maginot Line secure, France could commit fewer divisions to guard its eastern border, while the rest of the army deployed north into Belgium, where history suggested the main German thrust would come. The line, therefore, was both shield and economy of force, a means to stabilize one front while allowing flexibility elsewhere. Beyond the battlefield, the line was meant to play a subtler role: economic warfare. French planners understood that Germany's recovery after 1933 had been achieved only through a dangerous sleight of hand. Hitler's regime, unwilling to risk political humiliation by defaulting on its obligations, had turned to creative mechanisms to disguise its financial fragility. The most notorious of these were the so-called Mefo bills, promissory notes issued through a dummy corporation that allowed the Reich to secretly fund rearmament. Factories were not paid in cash but in these bills, which the state promised to redeem later. For a time, this concealed the scale of military spending and postponed the day of reckoning, but Mefo bills were little more than a pyramid of IOUs, with redemption dates looming ever closer. German credit abroad was already thin. Few nations were willing to underwrite a regime that repudiated Versailles while militarizing at breakneck speed. Without access to international loans, and with foreign creditors increasingly wary, the Nazi economy had only one way to survive: by consuming others and using their looted wealth to stave off economic collapse. This was the logic of the so-called shark economy. As a shark, it could not remain still. It had to keep moving, keep feeding, or perish. Austria's annexation in 1938 and Czechoslovakia's dismemberment in 1939 each brought not only territory, but also hard currency, raw materials, and industrial capacity. The regime's solvency depended less on productive efficiency at home and more on plunder from abroad. By 1939, therefore, the economic clock was ticking. The Reich could not afford a long war of attrition. It needed a lightning campaign, seething resources faster than its debts could come due. The French strategy was built to exploit this very imbalance. If Germany's only hope lay in a short victorious war, then France's answer was to deny her one. Secure behind the Maginot Line and confident in her alliances, France sought to prolong the struggle, stretching Germany's fragile finances to breaking point. Victory, in this conception, would come not from a grand offensive, but from outlasting the enemy's economic illusions. Yet by the time of the German attack, André Maginot himself was gone, having died in 1932. His successors carried forward his legacy, though not always in name. Edouard Daladier, Minister of War, and General Maurice Gamelin, Commander-in-Chief, inherited the line and the doctrine it represented. Both men remained committed to the central Maginot Principle, that France must fight defensively, sparing lives, while time and blockade weakened Germany. There was continuity too in the fear of manpower shortages. Daladier and Gamelin, like Maginot, believed France could not match Germany man for man. They therefore clung to the strategy of entrenchment and alliance, to resist behind fortifications, to wait for British and colonial forces to muster, and to strangle Germany's war effort with economic blockade as in 1914. For them, the Maginot Line was not merely concrete, but doctrine, the physical manifestation of a defensive worldview that spanned a generation of French leadership.
The French were very much stuck in a mentality that had evolved only right after World War I, and not really taken into consideration all of the developments that had happened, both doctrinal and technical.
Thus, as 1939 turned to 1940, two incompatible visions confronted one another. On one side, France, secure in her fortifications, betting that time, finance, and attrition would prove decisive. On the other, Germany, a predator whose survival depended on swift and total victory. Both sides prepared for war, but only one could be correct about how long that struggle would last. So, how is the Wehrmacht planning to defeat France so quickly? The answer lies in Bewegungskrieg, the war of movement, a doctrine developed in Prussia centuries earlier. Hemmed in by larger powers with greater population and resources, Prussia could never hope to win long positional wars of attrition or Stellungskrieg. Instead, its leaders adopted a mantra of kurz und vives, short and lively. Prussia would mobilize faster, march quicker, fight more intelligently, and strike harder than its enemies. The method centered on the Schwerpunkt, or strong point. Concentrate limited forces into a powerful spearhead, then hit the enemy's weak spot, usually the flanks or the rear. The ultimate goal was a Kesselschlacht, or cauldron battle, the encirclement and destruction of the enemy. This decisive blow delivered both military and political shock, breaking the enemy's will in one blow. The Prussians spent centuries refining Bewegungskrieg. In the 16 and 1700s, this doctrine enabled leaders like Frederick William and Frederick the Great to win victories over the likes of Sweden, Austria, France, and Russia, cementing Prussia's place in Europe. In 1871, victory over the French Empire gave Prussia the means to unite the German states into the German Empire and set the stage for the Great War 40 years later. At the outbreak of that titanic conflict, Germany once again turned to Bewegungskrieg. The Schlieffen Plan came close to encircling and defeating the French and British armies in the west, but the Allies managed to check the German advance, and the Western Front collapsed into Stellungskrieg. The trenches, barbed wire, and machine guns locking both sides in years of stalemate, with little hope of operational breakthrough. Germany triumphed in the east against Russia, but could not match the combined might of Britain, France, and later the United States. Germany was defeated, the army limited by treaty, and the empire itself dissolved. In Germany, Hans von Sicht was appointed Chief of Staff of the Weimar Republic's small military force, the Reichswehr. A veteran of the Eastern Front, his experience was of sprawling fronts which had made trenches impossible and where Germany had been able to fight battles of encirclement. The lesson was clear. Germany's future still lay in the old Prussian ideals of fast, mobile warfare. The Germans were not alone in that conclusion. Across Europe and beyond, it seemed that one piece of technology held the key to restoring the war of movement. Deployed in the closing stages of the Great War, they had already shown glimpses of their potential. By combining firepower, armor protection, and mobility in a single machine, they promised to break the deadlock of Stellungskrieg and secure operational breakthroughs. By the late 1920s, the British were leading the way with the tank. But disputes soon corrupted doctrine. Cavalry officers pushed cruiser tanks, fast and lightly armored, while others demanded slow but powerful infantry tanks, which would advance alongside foot soldiers. The Germans avoided these pitfalls. Their tanks, whether light or medium, could all move at the same pace. More importantly, the Germans recognized that tanks could seize ground but not hold it. Panzer divisions were balanced with infantry, engineers, signals, and support arms, all motorized to keep pace. The British and French did not follow suit. In 1939, the British 7th Armoured Division had 5 tank battalions but only 1 of motorized infantry. The French Division Cuirassée, DCR, fielded 4 battalions of heavy and light tanks, but likewise had just 1 of infantry. By contrast, the German Panzer Division had 3 or 4 tank battalions, complemented by 3 or 4 motorized infantry battalions, plus motorcycle troops, reconnaissance, engineers, and anti-aircraft, all advancing together and supporting one another. The French did have a comparable formation, the Division Légère Mécanique, with a more equal balance between tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and reconnaissance elements. But French doctrine undermined them. Instead of keeping these divisions as cohesive units for independent operations, commanders often fed them piecemeal into the line to plug gaps. The Germans also gave a great deal of thought to the question of how such a large and maneuverable force would be controlled. The answer was the radio, and unlike their French foes, the Germans fitted a receiver and transmitter into every single tank. Radios meant faster orders, sharper situational awareness, and better coordination with artillery and the Luftwaffe.
The Germans also had tank crews, had 5-man tank crews with specified employment. The French, the guy driving the tank commander, he had to reload the tank's gun while he was doing that stuff. So this played a big part.
Just as crucially, the radio also enabled the revival of Auftragstaktik, mission command, where headquarters set goals but left subordinates free to decide how to achieve them. This suited the Panzer divisions perfectly. Armored warfare demanded officers who were aggressive, quick to exploit openings, and ready to improvise. Commanders of all ranks were expected to push forward and exploit relentlessly. But mission command required a force of officers ready to lead with initiative and daring. Fortunately, von Seeckt also laid the groundwork for this. Restricted to 100,000 men by the Treaty of Versailles, Seeckt had transformed the Reichswehr into a Führerheer, an army of leaders. He retained 4,000 of the best imperial officers, imposed tough exams for new entrants, and trained every officer for duties one rank higher. Non-commissioned officers made up over half the force, ready to step up and become officers in wartime. When Hitler reintroduced conscription in 1935, this elite cadre became the Wehrmacht's backbone, and nowhere did their initiative shine more than in the Panzer arm. Thus, the Panzer Division became a true combined arms formation, self-sufficient and independent. With speed, firepower, radio connectivity, and adaptable leaders, they were the embodiment of the Bewegungskrieg. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 gave the world its first glimpse of this new weapon. Panzer divisions served mainly as spearheads for slower infantry armies, but even in this role showed speed and adaptability, repeatedly outflanking Polish forces. When tanks met resistance, Stukas acted as flying artillery to smash strongpoints. Within 18 days, army groups north and south had trapped most of the Polish army in a vast Kesselschlacht, killing or wounding 200,000 and capturing nearly 600,000. The doctrine was still in its infancy, but the campaign in Poland showed how mechanized forces, backed by air power, could win fast, decisive victories.
Hitler wanted to attack France already in October and November 1939 when the invasion of Poland was over.
Yet Armed Forces Chief of Staff General Franz Halder doubted the Panzers could repeat their success against the more powerful Western Allies. His first draft for a plan of attack was cautious. General Fedor von Bock's Army Group B would lead the main thrust into Belgium, Army Group A would cover his flank, while Army Group C stayed passive on the Maginot Line. General Erich von Manstein, Chief of Staff to Army Group A Commander Gerd von Rundstedt, dismissed Halder's plan as humiliating, little more than an inferior rerun of Schlieffen's. The flaw was obvious. Bock's troops would smash into the strongest Allied positions, anchored by Belgian fortresses in Liège and Dutch canals. At best, Germany might gain territory, but no breakthrough, no encirclement, and certainly no decisive victory, and a long and exposed flank inviting counterattack. Manstein and Rundstedt pressed for a bold alternative. Thrust through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse, and wheel right to trap the Allied armies in Belgium in a vast encirclement. It was a gamble that would bring either spectacular success or total ruin. The debate raged all winter. Could tanks even get through the Ardennes narrow forest roads? The High Command asked General Heinz Guderian, who had fought there in 1914. His reply, yes, they could.
Were the roads through the Ardennes impassable to tanks? No. Was the forest itself impassable to tanks? Yes.
Still, opposition persisted, and the two sides could agree on little more than the name of the operation, Fall Gelb, or Case Yellow. Then, chance intervened. In January 1940, a German staff plane crash-landed in Belgium, and key planning papers fell into Allied hands. Berlin assumed secrecy was lost and a new plan was needed. By chance, in February, Manstein lunched with Hitler, who invited the young general to outline his plan. The Führer, already eager for a more daring and spectacular solution, was impressed. On the 24th of February, Halder issued new orders. Manstein's plan was a go. Army Group B would now attack northern Belgium. This would divert the strongest Allied units and pin them in position. Then, the real hammer blow would be dealt by Army Group A, spearheaded by a new and unusual formation called Panzergruppe Kleist. Commanded by General Ewald von Kleist, this formation massed 5 panzer divisions and 3 motorized infantry divisions, 1,200 tanks, 360 reconnaissance vehicles, its own anti-aircraft corps, and dedicated fuel and supply systems. Crucially, it was designed to operate independently of the slower infantry divisions.
It would be fair to say that Panzergruppe Kleist was probably the most powerful tank force in 1940. This force had over half of Germany's tanks, but it's not just the sheer number of them, because actually the German tanks were, many of them were inferior to the French tanks. It's the way they were arranged into panzer divisions, which allowed them to be used organically. And Kleist had a lot of these panzer divisions. He had 3 in Guderian's corps, which he was able to use as an armoured spearhead to attack Sedan. And they were supported by motorised infantry, which were able to keep up with the panzers.
Its mission? Cross the Meuse, break into the French rear, and achieve an operational breakthrough. If successful, the panzers would sweep west, wheel north, and encircle the Allied armies in Belgium, the ultimate Kesselschlacht. On May 10, 1940, the plan went into action. At the tip of Panzergruppe Kleist, Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps, composed of the 1st, 2nd, and 10th Panzer Divisions, surged across Luxembourg and Belgium and into France. Fueled by amphetamines and Guderian's urgency, they pressed forward. The Ardennes roads clogged with traffic, but a meticulous logistics plan kept fuel and supplies flowing. In the face of serious delays, Auftragstatik thrived. German commanders threw together small Kampfgruppen, ad hoc battle groups of tanks, infantry, and reconnaissance troops to seize bridges, crossroads, and choke points before the Allies could react. The Luftwaffe added its weight, dive-bombing strong points like flying artillery. By May 13th, just 3 days into the campaign, Guderian's corps had reached the Meuse at Sedan. The stage was set for one of the most decisive river crossings in military history. German troops had already very much defied the odds to get so far so quickly, having to overcome more obstacles than just the Ardennes forest. Allied forces had made several attempts to check their advance, but failed to make a meaningful impact. On May 10th, the Belgian Chasseurs Ardennais, light infantry trained for forest fighting, carried out their mission, blowing bridges, laying obstacles, and offering resistance before falling back. Deeper in Belgium, the French 2nd and 5th Light Cavalry Divisions mounted the main defence, but they were brushed aside by the Panzer Divisions and retreated behind the River Semois, the last natural barrier before Sedan. The key point on the Semois was the town of Bouillon. Its bridges were blown, and French light cavalry garrisoned the town. The Germans should have faced a stiff fight for the crossing, but on the night of May 11th, shaken French troops abandoned Bouillon after skirmishing with the 1st Panzer Division's vanguard. When the main German force arrived the next morning, they found the town deserted and quickly began effecting a crossing of the river. From there, they pressed on through a chain of blockhouses before arriving at Sedan. A massive assault on the French positions there went ahead on May 13th, involving constant bombardment from the air and from heavy artillery. By the evening, all 3 of Guderian's panzer divisions, the 1st, 2nd, and 10th, had elements across the river, and French resistance was crumbling.
So Sedan was a very important target for the Germans. We can tell this by the amount of force they committed, with 3 panzer divisions trying to cross. And part of the reason why it was so important was it's a relatively weaker point on the line of French defences. Guderian himself also liked the idea of a crossing at Sedan. And one of the other reasons is that there was a highway leading from Sedan pretty much to Paris.
The makings of a great victory were in place, but the battle was not won just yet. The Germans may have broken through at Sedan, but a breakthrough is not a breakout. The French had deep reserves and shorter supply lines. If they strike quickly, they have a real chance to crush the thinly held German bridgehead. It fell to General Jean Favigny, commander of the 21st Corps, to deal with the breached Sedan. His powerful reserve began moving up during May 13th, comprising the 3rd Armoured Division, the 3rd Motorised Infantry Division, 3 independent tank battalions, and 2 light cavalry divisions. All told, that gave him up to 300 tanks to draw from. Yet, Favigny let the opportunity slip through his fingers, revealing all of the shortcomings of the French way of war. At about 5 a.m. on May 14th, Flavigny urged his divisional commanders to attack later that morning. But straight away there were so many delays and problems with moving up the tanks, fueling them, and marching the infantry forward that Flavigny postponed the attack until 2 in the afternoon. In the afternoon, that plan was once again fatally undermined by poor command and control and a lack of aggression. Unable to call on the full strength of his forces, Flavigny allowed himself to be swayed by panicking French soldiers streaming back from the front, who reported that hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of German tanks were streaming out of the bridgehead. Fearing disaster, Flavigny cancelled the attack at the last minute. Isolated tank units did make limited thrusts, but left unsupported by infantry, they were beaten back by the German anti-tank guns. But the truth was far removed from Flavigny's fears. In reality, on May 14th, Guderian's bridgehead was thinly held as a panzer division struggled to get their vehicles across the Meuse. Those who had crossed the river were unprepared for battle. The drive by 1st and 2nd Panzer divisions had left them short of ammunition and fuel, and they both had reported themselves unavailable for the immediate defense. The 10th Panzer Division still had not reached the designated phase line. In fact, Flavigny's 3rd Armoured Division alone outnumbered the German tanks that had managed to cross the Meuse, and the perimeter was primarily held by the infantry regiment Grossdeutschland. Powerful, well-trained, but not designed to fight French armoured units alone. The French general had missed the chance to strike a crushing blow. With the attack cancelled, Flavigny retreated into the caution and conservatism of the French general staff. He switched to the defence, scattering his units across a wide defensive arc. This meant that when he tried to attack again on the morning of May 15th, French commanders had little idea where their units actually were. Radio communications were so patchy that it took hours for them to get an accurate picture of the situation. Flavigny once again postponed the attack before calling it off altogether. Instead of an operational level counterattack, the French fed what troops they could muster into piecemeal tactical fighting for the village of Ston, which was occupied by the Germans on May 14th. Rooted in the linear principles of the Great War, both Corps Commander Flavigny and Army Commander Charles Hunsiger believed that Ston had to be retaken before a counterattack could be launched on the bridgehead. For the Germans, Ston was a perfect deception. Guderian left the 10th Panzer Division and the Grossdeutschland Regiment to occupy the French for several days of bitter house-to-house fighting and tank combat in the ruined village. Meanwhile, Guderian's main strike force, the 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions, had the time and space to break out of the bridgehead and push west. From there, the story is a familiar one as historians have detailed time and time again. Guderian's panzers pushed westward, reached the Channel coast and trapped the Allied forces in a giant cauldron, securing victory and forcing the British to evacuate their forces from Dunkirk.
If we look back to the start of the battle when the German troops are massing on the Meuse and preparing to cross, it probably seems like the French hold most of the cards and have got the advantage here. And we can actually see when the Germans do start to cross and they head through Sedan on the 13th and the 14th, they don't actually get all that far all that quickly. But really, it's because the French generals didn't act with the speed and aggressiveness that they should have done, and they didn't crush the German breach. And that's really what led to the failure of the French here.
But this leads us to a wider point. Was the breakthrough at Sedan the critical moment of Fall Gelb? If the French had managed to hold out here, could they have held the Germans back altogether and saved their country? It's a tempting thought. Heinz Guderian and the events at Sedan tend to occupy a dominant position in the historical narrative. Stop them and the whole thing collapses. But just 3 of Army Group A's 7 Panzer divisions crossed the Meuse at Sedan. 4 crossed elsewhere, playing a crucial and often overlooked role in the fighting. Further north, across the border in Belgium, Generals Max von Hartlieb and Erwin Rommel led the Panzer divisions across the Meuse at Hue and Dinant. The French frontline divisions fought hard against the crossings, turning the Meuse into a watery grave for many German soldiers, but they were left unsupported by the French armoured reserve, which suffered from constant breakdowns, fuel shortages, and a lack of coordination. Given the space and time to get his tanks across, Rommel broke out of his bridgehead the following morning. Putting the principle of Auftragstaktik into practice, he led a small battle group charging ahead of the main force. It was a risky move, one which almost saw him killed by a French anti-tank gun. But the gamble paid off, and he pushed on for about another 25 kilometers. Scrambling to halt the German advance, the French brought forward the 1st Armoured Division on the night of May 14th and positioned them for a set-piece battle around the nearby village of Flavion. Their objective? To halt Rommong's advance. Things began poorly on the morning of May 15th, when Rommong managed to sidestep the French force, outflanking them to the south and taking his 7th Panzer Division on a thrust to the rear. It was left to Max von Hartlieb and the 5th Panzer Division to engage the French 1st Armoured. On paper, the French had a good chance to win the battle. They outnumbered the Germans with 170 tanks to 120. Of these 170, 65 were Char-B heavy tanks, among the most heavily armed and armoured tanks in the world at the time. In the opening moments of the battle, German Panzer III commanders were shocked to see their rounds simply bounce off the Char-B's thick armour. But superior armoured protection was not enough. While Sedan demonstrated French failure on an operational level, it was Flavion which showed the divergence between France and Germany on a tactical level.
The French weren't very well prepared for this new type of warfare. Although some of their systems, their tanks and artillery were modern, were capable, and were often better than the equivalent armies, they still practiced fairly outdated methods of command and control, and they were still not ready for the new type of war.
As this invasion begins, we have two sets of militaries that are operating in completely different time frames. That's the easiest way to put it. The Germans have much more effective communication, both on a theoretical, philosophical level and on a technical level.
With full radio coverage across their vehicles, German officers could orchestrate their platoons and companies into fighting complex movements, while the radio-lacking French quickly became disjointed. Groups of German tanks attacked and withdrew on command, drawing the heavier French tanks out of formation. Once separated, groups of panzers pounced on their isolated foes. Many French heavy tanks simply ran out of fuel and were abandoned or destroyed by their own crews. Radio communication also ensured excellent coordination with the Luftwaffe, and the Stuka dive bombers acted as a vital force multiplier. Deployed into battle without accompanying anti-aircraft guns, the French tanks had little answer to German air power. In the end, Flavion was a decisive victory for the Germans, confirming the merit of their interwar developments. With von Hartlieb mauling the French 1st Armoured Division, Rommel was free to push far into the French rear, embarking on a legendary 80-kilometer drive that earned his division the nickname Ghost Division. This plunged French defensive efforts into chaos, scattered an entire motorized infantry division to the winds, and took thousands of prisoners. Rommel wasn't the only one applying the principles of maneuver warfare. Werner Kempf commanded the 6th Panzer Division and crossed the Meuse at Monthermé, a midpoint between the northernmost crossing at Dinant and Hue and the southernmost crossing at Sedan. Kempf originally made slower progress than his fellow generals. He faced especially stiff opposition from a well-trained French colonial machine gun regiment. Dug into strong defensive positions on the Monthermé Peninsula, they gave Kempf little more than a toehold across the Meuse by the end of May 14th. Progress was so slow that Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group A, threatened to relegate Kempf's division to little more than a supporting role. Facing resistance from the enemy and his own superiors, Kempf launched a new drive on the morning of May 15th. At that very moment, he was handed a stroke of luck from the enemy. Despite the tenacious defense of the colonial troops, the French High Command ordered the unit to withdraw west, opening the path for Kempf's forces. The German general seized the opportunity and threw together an improvised detachment consisting of a panzer battalion, motorcycle troops, engineers, and artillery. Because of the Panzer Division's fully motorized structure, all of these units were able to keep pace with each other and drive rapidly into the enemy's rear. In fact, they advanced so rapidly that they caught the French entirely unprepared. Kempf's force scythed through the middle of the French 2nd Armoured Division, which was still vulnerable in the process of deploying to hold the line. As with Rommel's advance, destroying the enemy was not the most important objective here, and Kempf left a disoriented French tank unit behind for the 8th Panzer Division to finish off. Meanwhile, he continued to push west, and in just 5 hours, his force had advanced 55 kilometers and captured the crucial town of Montcornet. Within days, Rommel, von Hartlieb and Kempf had advanced well into the French rear, destroying any hopes of a French retreat to a new defensive line. Guderian followed suit, and his divisions reached Montcornet on May 16th. Between them, these generals and their panzer divisions gave Germany the ability to take on and destroy larger and more powerful forces. They had the flexibility to create smaller task forces, the speed to bypass unprepared enemy defensive, and the fully mechanized power to exploit the breakthrough. This was Bewegungskrieg, the old Prussian way of war, updated for the 20th century. In the meantime, the shortcomings of the French were becoming more prominent, and their mistakes were being punished decisively. In the chaos after the breakthrough at Sedan, General Charles Hunziker, commander of the French Second Army, convinced himself that the real German threat was a drive south to isolate the eastern forts of the Maginot Line, not an armoured thrust breaking west. On May 15th, he ordered his divisions to pull back onto a new line from Attigny to Hainaut.
His logic, his reason for doing this was that he wanted to defend the Maginot Line further in the southeast on the French-German border. And there is a certain military logic to that, and if you were sympathetic to that, you could see where he's coming from. But really, it's that decision which opens the door, essentially, for the German panzers to start their drive west.
With this move, Hunziker not only unwittingly aided Panzergruppe Kleist in their drive to the coast, but also left the westernmost Maginot fortress, Ouvrage La Ferté, isolated and exposed on the Hainaut-Malandry ridge. For the Germans, La Ferté became a target worth eliminating, tactically to secure their flank, and politically to show that even the great fortresses of the Maginot Line could be destroyed.
For the Germans, the Maginot Line was something like a white elephant where everybody was afraid of. They picked the smallest one in an extreme position, isolated position. They were well prepared. They knew exactly what they did here. It's not that they dropped in and said, oh, there's a fort, we'll attack it. No, they trained a long time and prepared this assault on La Ferté, and they executed simply perfectly.
La Ferté was modest compared to other, larger ouvrages on the line. Occupying a commanding position with an excellent view, La Ferté consisted of 2 combat blocks buried in the earth and defended by machine guns and anti-tank guns, manned by 107 men. Artillery cover was provided by the neighbouring fortress equipped with 75mm guns. La Ferté certainly had its weaknesses, however. Its construction was somewhat rushed, leaving it inferior to other structures on the line. In addition, like the defences at Sedan, it was designed to be supported by regular infantry and mechanised units. Without these units, La Ferté was liable to being surrounded and cut off. In spite of this task, the French High Command ordered the troops to hold their positions at all costs, because so much of the nation's prestige was bound up in the Maginot Line. In the end, events played out as the Germans planned. The attack was conducted by regular infantry forces, separate to the mechanised assault on Sedan. By May 17th, the infantry armies had surrounded Fort La Ferté. French relief efforts failed, and finally, on the evening of May 18th, the Germans launched their final assault. After an enormous artillery barrage, combat engineers used satchel charges to breach the iron skin of one of La Ferté's weapon positions. Grenades tossed inside started fires, detonating ammunition and releasing torrents of smoke which overwhelmed the ventilation system. As they choked to death on the acrid smoke, the French defenders desperately requested permission to surrender. That permission was denied, and the entire garrison succumbed to asphyxiation on the morning of May 19th. So how exactly has this been allowed to happen? Was Sedan truly as deficient in fortifications and manpower as some historical analysis has claimed? After the war, Sedan was often dismissed as weakly defended. A common narrative will be that the Germans were able to simply drive around the fortifications of the Maginot Line. But the truth is far more complicated than that. The great forts or ouvrages of the Maginot did end southeast of Sedan, yet the town itself was defended by a network of blockhouses, artillery casemates, and pillboxes built in the late 1930s.
The Maginot Line, as named after Henri Maginot, the sort of original one, does only run up to Fort La Ferté, but there are other defensive structures running from Fort La Ferté through Sedan and up to the Channel, which, although not technically part of what you might call the original Maginot Line, are still defensive structures.
These positions were manned by local reservists, familiar with the terrain and defences, fighting not just for their country, but for their homes and families too. The terrain itself added a great deal of strength. The river Meuse, 60 meters wide, was to be bridged only under fire. The steep slopes of the southern bank gave the French commanding positions over the German lines of advance. But despite this strong foundation, problems abounded. Some of the fortifications were unfinished, and the infantrymen, often older men, were spread thin and were short on equipment. Anti-tank guns were particularly scarce. Some of the blockhouses were poorly concealed, and the fields of fire were limited by the woods.
There are gaps in between the pillboxes, obviously, because it's not like on the map where there's one solid line, just running through the French countryside, but all of these structures are fairly close to each other, and they are very cleverly placed. They've got good lines of sight. The guns can fire together like this to prevent people from moving in between, and they would be a serious obstacle to any German troops who are advancing.
Yet, these defences were never designed to hold off a German advance indefinitely. Their role was to delay such an advance until such time as French reserve forces were sent into action. These forces would then seal off any breach and drive the Germans back. The defence of Sedan relied on this overarching French doctrine functioning correctly. Ultimately, Operation Pfalmgelb would prove to be a decisive German victory, carving apart their old enemy in a matter of weeks. The war would continue, and the prospect of Allied troops entering Berlin for the foreseeable future was relegated to realms of fantasy. In the decades after 1940, Western historiography tended to credit German brilliance rather than French inadequacy for the success. German generals writing their post-war memoirs framed the campaign as a triumph of operational innovation, the model of a modern mobile war. It was a convenient narrative, one that preserved professional prestige and allowed the Wehrmacht to be admired in a clean environment, separated from their ultimate complicity in Nazi crimes against humanity. French historians, meanwhile, had little incentive to dismantle the myth, a stubborn blotch on the impressive record of a proud military nation. Attributing defeat to a brilliant enemy was preferable to revisiting their own strategic and political dysfunction. Anglo-American writers largely accepted this framing, seeing Pfalmgelb as a coming of age of the tank and the triumph of modernity over stagnation, rather than examining the specific institutional and cultural quirks that had defined both sides. Only in recent decades has this consensus begun to erode. New research reveals that Pfalmgelb was less a masterpiece than a sequence of calculated risks and improvised opportunities. Its success owed as much to French paralysis as to German daring. Though the tactical brilliance of some German officers such as Heinz Guderian, Erwin Rommel, and Max von Hartlieb does hold up to scrutiny, the idea of a masterful plan executed from top to bottom with merciless precision was, in truth, a fragile contingency. The campaign's legacy can still be read in the walls of Ouvrage La Ferté, left to decay for decades, an unwanted relic of 1940. The names and sacrifice of its defenders were allowed to slip into obscurity. Only recently, through local efforts, has the fortress been restored and reopened to the public, and extensive research conducted to trace exactly who was present there and allow these souls to be remembered properly. But invariably, when analysing French culpability, we soon arrive at the critical question: where, then, should blame be assigned? The indecision of 21st Corps Commander Jean Flavigny, who perhaps had the best opportunity of anyone to plug the gap at Sedan? Perhaps Minister of War Edouard Daladier and Commander-in-Chief Maurice Gamelin, whose fixation on drawing the fighting into northern and central Belgium may have compromised French forces at home? One name in particular continues to recur, though, that of 2nd Army Commander Charles Hunziker. Warnings had reached him in the months before the German offensive. In March 1940, a parliamentary mission led by Pierre Taittinger inspected the Sedan sector, which reported the state of defences there as insufficient. Hunziker dismissed the criticism as alarmist. To him, the Ardennes forest and the Meuse River formed obstacles too formidable for any serious assault. "I do not believe the Germans will ever consider attacking in the region of Sedan," he declared. Yet even as he spoke, he disregarded a French war game of 1938 that had demonstrated precisely that possibility. During the long months of the phony war, Hunziker's concerns lay not with strengthening the front and preparing for a battle, but with preserving local routine. Agricultural activities, he felt, should not be disrupted by war preparations. No permission was sought from landowners to clear their fields, leaving artillery units without practice ranges. The divisions assigned to hold Sedan, the 55th and 71st Infantry Divisions, were B-series reserve formations, short of training, understrength and poorly equipped. The bunkers that were completed were makeshift affairs, often uncamouflaged, unreinforced and vulnerable to infiltration, and little attempt was made by Hunziker to address these issues. In contrast, Hunziker placed his best troops further east at Mouzon, which he would later abandon without a fight. Even before battle was joined, his Second Army was stretched perilously thin. 7 divisions covering a frontage where 14 would have been prudent. Thus, when the blow fell, his army was exposed. French reconnaissance aircraft had already observed German columns, including armored units with bridging equipment pouring through the Ardennes. But Hunziker failed to grasp that the main thrust was aimed squarely at Sedan. As air power became available to him, Hunziker failed to use it properly to strafe and harass the German troops and supply lines in their vulnerable state. Even when German artillery opened a massive bombardment on May 13th, he hesitated, convinced that this was still not the decisive blow. The collapse at Sedan was swift and irreversible. French forces lost cohesion, and the German advance spilled into the open country beyond. Hunziker's errors, his complacency, his misjudgments, his fatal delays had arguably made victory irretrievable.
It's not only Hunziker who fails at this point, although his failure is crucial, because when he, I guess, panics or whatever it is he does, when he starts calling back his forces against their own will, he's actually playing right into the hands of the Germans. And he widens a gap that is which is very narrow and very hard to get through for Guderian and his forces, and just opens up a wide gap that provides Guderian with a free entry into France.
Yet his career did not end in disgrace. Protected by political connections, Hunziker mostly escaped blame. Responsibility was deflected onto the commander of the neighboring 9th Army, General André Corap. Hunziker himself, one observer noted, bore the practically criminal complacency that doomed Sedan. But instead of ruin, he found promotion. From late May, he was among the first to argue openly for an armistice. In June 1940, it was Hunziker who led the French delegation to Compiègne, and from there, in the railway carriage at Rotande, he signed the Act of Surrender. In the new Vichy regime, this marked him as a man of influence. Appointed Secretary of State for War, he held invariable sway in the commissions of inquiry that sought to assign responsibility for France's fall. The hand that should have been on the tiller now found itself instead grasping a judge's gavel. So, was Charles Hunziker a traitor? It's a question we may never truly know the answer to. There is certainly circumstantial evidence to suggest it's possible.
There are some who think that Hunziker had underlying sympathies with the Germans, and that's why he acted the way he did. It's hard to say whether there's ground to these theories because there really isn't a lot of evidence. In my view, although Hunziker may have had personal sympathies to Germany and to authoritarianism and fascist-leaning governments, and it may have influenced his decision-making, it's hard to say whether this was a deliberately malicious decision designed to bring about the defeat of France.
It is awful suspicious, his activities looking back, and that he leapfrogged over several higher French generals to be the one that signed the armistice with Germany, and he did well out of that, and he was notoriously anti-Semitic. Was he doing something in cahoots with the Germans? Lost to time. I don't think anyone will ever know if that's true. You want to give him the benefit of the doubt that he wasn't? That's fine, in which case he was just incompetent. And he shifted the blame for his failures onto Corap, who was doing the best he could with the worst the French had, and it was working.
He soon dies in a plane accident, That's one of the reasons why we don't know so much about Hunziker's motivations and what he did during these crucial days, because there was no way of asking him, because by the time the war ended and France had been liberated from the Nazis, well, he was dead.
In the end, perhaps it doesn't matter whether Charles Hunziker was a traitor or simply a man out of his depth. France did not fall because of one man's malice or mediocrity, but because of an entire system's inability to see itself clearly. Hunziker was not its cause so much as its consequence, perhaps merely the most obvious symptom of a chronic sickness that would take half a century to diagnose in posterity.
It's better to see Hunziker as representative of the failures of the French command than to paint it as something treasonous. I personally think it's to the point of criminal negligence, because things like thinking that the Germans will never hit Sedan, thinking that it's going to take them a week to get through the Ardennes, doesn't gel with the intelligence that they're getting. So they're not only pursuing wishful thinking, they're actually ignoring the evidence that they're being given that this isn't going to work the way you think it will.
Simple answers to complex questions such as this rarely capture the nuance of the entire situation. Whether we're attributing the outcome solely to Guderian's genius, as people have done in the past, or to Hunziker's incompetence or supposed treachery, as some do in the present, the error is the same. Ultimately, the legacy of the Battle of Sedan must serve as yet another reminder that history does not happen in a vacuum.